Imagine standing on the scorching concrete of the Kennedy Space Center. It's August 28th, 1997.
Right.
And you have literally rented out one of the most iconic symbols of human achievement, technological triumph, just to host a massive, globally broadcast acoustic performance.
Like a radio special, yeah.
Exactly. The cameras are rolling, the press is gathered, the money spent on this launch is just astronomical, and you are trying to project this absolute unshakable confidence to the entire world.
But there's a glaring problem.
No, a huge, uncomfortable problem that everyone in the room is acutely aware of, even if they won't say it out loud. The voice that sold 100 million records for you, the literal face of your franchise, is just gone.
Completely gone.
And the American public, the very people you are trying to reach with this multi-million-dollar space launch, is about to completely ignore you.
It is the ultimate projection of power. I mean, masking a deep internal vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because you don't book the Kennedy Space Center if you are completely confident in the music speaking for itself.
Yeah.
You book it because you need the spectacle to, distract from the massive void standing at the center of the stage.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you into the anatomy of what might be the most expensive ego death in rock history.
It really is.
We're looking at what happens when a legendary band loses its iconic frontman, refuses to accept that the landscape has changed, and just tries to force a new era through sheer willpower.
Right, and we have a whole stack of sources detailing the history of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, we're focusing on their 15th and ultimately final studio album from 1987, which is called Calling All Stations.
Calling All Stations. I mean, it's frequently dismissed by casual listeners as just a weird footnote in the Genesis discography.
Yeah, totally. But our goal today is to show you why it is actually a crucial masterclass.
Yeah.
Analyzing the failure of this specific album provides, honestly, an unparalleled look at the changing tides of 1990s rock radio, the brutal reality of audience expectations, and just the suffocating psychological weight of carrying a legacy brand on your shoulders.
For sure. So we are going to completely dissect the transition today. We've got the grueling audition process, the incredibly tense, almost corporate studio dynamics, and, the harsh commercial reality that shattered the band's illusion and put them on ice for a decade.
A decade, yeah.
So to really understand how a band ends up broadcasting a failure from a space center, we kind of have to rewind and look at the catalyst. We need to look at the fracture.
The timeline here is just essential for understanding the mindset of everyone involved. So you have to go back to the early 1990s.
Okay, take us back.
Genesis is coming off the We Can't Dance tour, which was just a gargantuan global undertaking. I mean, they were playing stadiums, selling millions of copies.
Just massive.
Yeah, and that tour wraps up in November of 1992. And following that massive peak, the band effectively goes into hibernation.
They scatter, basically, and they only come back together for one single charity performance in September of 1993.
Right.
Now, during this hiatus, the individual members are not just, sitting around on the couch. Keyboardist Tony Banks puts out an album under a project called Strictly Inc.
Uh-huh.
And Mike Rutherford, the guitarist and bassist, he's experiencing genuine, massive chart success, continuing with his own project, Mike and the Mechanics.
Right. But the real gravitational center of the band's hiatus is the drummer and lead vocalist, Phil Collins.
Of course.
At this point in the early 90s, Phil Collins' solo career is a certified juggernaut. It operates on a scale that rivals, and honestly, in some markets exceeds, Genesis itself.
It's wild to think about.
It is. And during this break, he writes and releases an album called Both Sides.
And the sources emphasize that Both Sides wasn't just like another pop record for Collins. It was a deeply personal, incredibly intimate album.
Yeah, very vulnerable.
He played all the instruments himself. He recorded it at his home. It was just unfiltered, Phil. And the whiplash of going from that intensely personal solo experience back to the corporate machinery of Genesis, well, that's what finally breaks the foundation.
The fracture actually happens at that 1993 charity gig you mentioned.
Oh, really? At the gig?
Yeah, Collins goes to play this show with Banks and Rutherford, and he realizes that singing the Genesis material suddenly feels entirely unnatural.
Wow.
The quote we have from him in the sources is incredibly revealing. He said, and I quote, "For the first time, I felt like an actor playing somebody else's part."
I really want to focus on that specific phrase, an actor playing a part.
It's heavy.
It is. Because when you think about a sports franchise, right? Say you have a star quarterback who has won you multiple championships.
Okay.
He sells all the jerseys. He is the face of the organization. If he suddenly retires because his heart isn't in it, the team panics, sure, but they usually try to draft a rookie and rebuild around the existing offensive line.
Right. They assume the playbook still works. Well, I would actually challenge the quarterback analogy here because it understates Collins' role. He wasn't just the quarterback. He was the head coach and the offensive coordinator simultaneously.
Oh, that's a good point.
Collins had spent well over a decade utilizing massive mental energy to compartmentalize two completely different identities.
Yeah, it must have been exhausting.
Seriously. He was Phil Collins, the solo pop star, writing these vulnerable ballads, and he was Phil Collins, the Genesis frontman, singing these grand, heavily structured, progressive-tinged rock epics that Banks and Rutherford largely architected.
The mental toll of that double life. You were constantly switching masks.
Precisely. And what that actor quote tells us is that the compartmentalization finally failed. The firewall between his true artistic self and his band persona completely burned down.
Right.
He could no longer put on the costume. He wasn't angry at the band. He was just fundamentally disconnected from the music they were asking him to sing.
So the writing is on the wall in 1993. But the actual administrative divorce takes a surprisingly long time.
A very long time.
It isn't until the summer of 1995 that Collins sits down in a meeting with their longtime manager, Tony Smith, and officially pulls the plug. And the public doesn't even find out until a press release is quietly issued in March of 1996. The delay alone tells you how massive this entity was. I mean, it takes 3 years just to stop the machinery and let the front man walk out the door.
Because undoing a multi-million-dollar global enterprise is not a quick process. But that long delay also meant Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford had years to sit with the anxiety of impending silence.
Just waiting for the shoe to drop.
Yeah. By the time the press release hits in 1996, the two founders are left staring at each other in an empty room, facing a terrifying existential question. Do we still exist without him?
And their reaction to that terror is just fascinating to me. They don't immediately start calling famous singers to see who wants the job.
No, they don't.
The sources note that in January 1996, before the public even knows Collins is out, Banks and Rutherford just start writing music together. They need to prove to themselves that the engine still turns over.
But look at how they wrote. They generated the basic musical structures, the chord progressions, the atmospheric beds, without any lyrics and without any idea of who would be singing them.
Right.
They were entirely focused on the architecture of the sound.
They are literally pouring the concrete foundation, framing the walls, putting on the roof, all without having any clue who is actually going to live inside the house.
That's a great way to put it.
Doesn't that suggest they weren't actually looking for a new band member? Like, they were just looking for a vocal instrument, a specific texture to slot into the machine they had already built.
Well, I wouldn't call it purely cynical, though it certainly looks that way from the outside.
Yeah.
I think it stems from a deep fear of losing control.
Okay, how so?
When you lose an overarching creative force like Phil Collins, you instinctively cling to the only thing you can still control, which is the composition.
Oh, sure.
Banks and Rutherford were writing the music first because they needed to reassure themselves that Genesis still had a distinct musical identity independent of Collins' voice.
Wow.
Once they felt they had that structural proof, they felt safe enough to begin the audition process.
And the audition process is where the story takes a massive left turn.
Oh, yeah.
They narrow it down to 2 final candidates. The first is David Longdon, an English singer who had been brought to their attention by producer Nick Davis.
Right.
Davis had heard Longdon's track, Hieroglyphics of Love, and thought he was a great fit. Longdon, for context, would eventually go on to have a great career fronting the prog rock band Big Big Train.
So he had a sensibility that made sense for Genesis.
Exactly. But then you look at the other candidate in the room, Ray Wilson, and Wilson's background is a total system shock for a band like Genesis.
A total shock.
Yeah.
Because Ray Wilson was a Scottish singer and guitarist, and he was coming out of a band called Stiltskin.
And Stiltskin was heavily influenced by grunge. We are talking about Genesis, the kings of 1970s esoteric prog and 1980s immaculately polished pop, seriously courting a grunge singer in 1996. It's wild.
Tony Banks was actually the one who favored Wilson. He had heard Stiltskin's 1994 album, The Mind's Eye, and was just captivated by Wilson's vocal tone.
Okay.
But bringing a grunge-adjacent singer into a legacy art rock band reveals a massive amount about their internal strategy. The mid-90s music scene had undergone a violent paradigm shift.
Oh, absolutely.
Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, they'd completely rewritten the rules of rock radio. Genesis, with their slick, pristine 80s production, was in imminent danger of looking like an absolute dinosaur.
So you think Ray Wilson was a deliberate survival tactic, like a calculated move?
Absolutely. Ray Wilson was their asteroid defense system.
I love that.
By bringing in a singer with a darker, grittier, alternative edge, Banks and Rutherford were trying to artificially inject modern relevance into their brand. They were hoping his vocal timbre would act as a bridge between their classic architectural songwriting and the moody, cynical landscape of 1990s rock.
But before Wilson gets the job, they put him through his psychological gauntlet. The mechanics of these auditions are just wild.
Very intense.
For his first audition, the sources say they had Wilson sing classic Genesis tracks. But here's the catch. They muted Phil Collins' vocal track on the playback.
Just think about the psychological pressure of that environment. You aren't just singing a song in a room with two rock legends.
Right.
You are actively being asked to step into the negative space, the literal silence, left by one of the most recognizable and successful voices in pop music history.
That is terrifying.
Every note you hit is instantly, instinctively compared to the ghost track playing in their heads.
It is a terrifying exercise. And then for his second audition, they up the stakes even more. They bring him into the studio, hit play on the brand new lyricless instrumental tracks they had written, and just ask him to hum and sing vocal ideas on the spot.
Just improvise.
Yeah. Improvise over our complex prog rock structures right now, go.
And he clearly delivered, because the sources point out that the on-the-spot vocal takes from that very session were actually used by Tony Banks to shape the verses for a song that ended up on the album There Must Be Some Other Way.
Wow.
Wilson proved he could navigate their architecture and add his own distinct flavor to it.
So the choice is made. Ray Wilson is in. But I have to bring up the way they handled the rejection of David Longdon, because it is just a masterclass in deeply uncomfortable British rock band avoidance.
Oh, it is.
It's November 1996. Mike Rutherford does the professional thing. He picks up the phone, calls Longdon, and delivers the bad news directly. You didn't get the gig, best of luck.
Right, a standard, respectable industry rejection.
Exactly. But Tony Banks, the sources explicitly note that Tony Banks informs Longdon he didn't get the job by sending him a Christmas card with a lengthy message inside.
The passive aggression is staggering.
I am laughing just picturing it. Imagine walking to your mailbox in December. You open a lovely holiday card with a snowy village on the front.
Merry Christmas, David.
Yeah. Merry Christmas, David. Hope you have a wonderful new year. By the way, your dream of fronting a stadium rock band is dead, and we went with the grunge guy. Warmest regards, Tony.
It is incredibly telling about the interpersonal communication styles that govern Genesis. It highlights a severe aversion to direct emotional conflict, preferring instead to hide behind polite, formalized distance.
Right.
And that exact inability to communicate directly and collaboratively is exactly what poisons the atmosphere once they finally move into the recording studio to make the album.
Because now they have their new frontman. Ray Wilson is officially announced to the public in June 1997. The band sets up shop at their own private studio, The Farm in Surrey.
Yep.
And immediately, the reality of being a legacy band collides violently with the desire to create something new.
The first major logistical hurdle in the studio is the rhythm section. Phil Collins didn't just sing. He was one of the most inventive, distinct drummers of his generation.
For sure.
You cannot simply replace him with one person.
You literally have to hire two different people to replace the engine room. They bring in Nirzid Kahu, an incredibly talented Israeli session drummer, and Nick DiVirgilio, an American drummer who is playing with the prog rock band Spock's Beard.
Both phenomenal players. But the most revealing detail about the studio sessions actually involves the drummer who was purposefully excluded from the room.
Oh, Chester Thompson.
Yes.
This detail really breaks my heart. Chester Thompson is a legend. He was the touring drummer for Genesis for decades.
Decades, yeah.
He was the guy sitting right behind Phil Collins, perfectly mirroring his complex drum fills in front of hundreds of thousands of people. He knew the absolute DNA of the band better than almost anyone alive.
True.
And according to the sources, Thompson actively approached Mike Rutherford and offered to play drums on this new album.
An offer that makes complete logical sense. He's the natural successor to maintain the band's rhythmic continuity. But Rutherford declines.
And the reason he declines is the truly fascinating part. Rutherford says no because Chester Thompson asked to be made a full-fledged member of the band.
If you want to understand the corporate mentality of legacy rock bands, This is the perfect case study.
It really is.
Genesis had operated as a strict trio. Banks, Rutherford, Collins. Since 1978, that trio was the brand. It was the financial structure, the equity split, the voting bloc.
Right.
With Collins gone, Banks and Rutherford were desperate to maintain that exact power dynamic.
Yeah.
2 founding fathers and 1 new employee.
It is literally a corporate restructuring where the founders refuse to give equity to the most loyal, hardest working manager who actually knows how to run the factory, simply because they want to keep the pie divided into their neat traditional slices.
Exactly.
They would rather alienate a deeply capable veteran and risk the quality of the product than dilute their ownership of the brand.
Exactly. They were fiercely protecting a hierarchy that no longer structurally existed.
Yeah.
And we see that identical rigid hierarchy applied directly to how Ray Wilson was treated in the creative process.
The technology they were using in the studio is a perfect metaphor for this control.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources note they were recording on a system called Radar. Now, for you listening, in 1997, this was cutting-edge stuff. It was a non-linear digital audio recording software that tracked 24 channels directly to computer hard drives, moving away from traditional analog tape.
We need to explain why that technological shift matters to the psychology of the album.
Please do.
When you record on analog tape, you are largely capturing a live performance. The band plays, you capture the magic in the room, and if you want to change it, it requires physically splicing tape. It's a risky, destructive process.
Right, you have to be careful.
It encourages organic collaboration because you have to play together to get a good take.
But with non-linear digital recording on a hard drive, you don't have to perform together at all.
Precisely. You can record a guitar line on Tuesday, a drum fill on Friday, and perfectly align them on a screen next week.
Wow.
You can copy, paste, loop, and endlessly micromanage every single millisecond of audio. It allows a songwriter to build a track like they're assembling Lego bricks in isolation.
Which perfectly enabled Tony Banks' worst tendencies as an architect. He didn't need a live band breathing life into the room. He could just endlessly tinker on his hard drive.
Right.
And this brings us to Ray Wilson's experience in that environment. Wilson later admitted that his creative input on the album was, quote, pretty small.
He noted a distinct difference between the 2 founders. With Mike Rutherford, Wilson felt he had some free rein. He observed that Rutherford doesn't know what he wants until he hears it, which implies a willingness to experiment, to throw ideas at the wall and see what sticks.
But with Tony Banks, it was a brick wall. Wilson clashed heavily with Banks because Banks didn't want to experiment. The sources say Banks had firm, incredibly rigid ideas worked out from the very beginning.
Banks is the architect who drew the blueprints, framed the house, and locked the doors.
Yeah.
When the new tenant, Ray Wilson, walked in and suggested maybe moving a window to let in some more light, Banks refused. He wanted Wilson to simply execute the vocal melodies exactly as they had been digitally preordained on the Radar system.
So out of this incredibly controlled, technologically precise, heavily hierarchical studio environment, we get a specific set of songs.
We do.
We need to look at the anatomy of this album because the track list they finalized showcases the absolute ceiling of Wilson's potential and the fatal limitations of Banks' rigidity.
Let's examine the title track, Calling All Stations. The sources highlight that this was actually the very first track Banks and Rutherford wrote for the album, back when they were just testing the waters without a singer.
And it ended up being chosen as the album opener. What is wild is that they kept most of the original musical takes from those early instrumental sessions for the final recorded version.
Right.
But this song is arguably the greatest success of the entire project, and it was actually Ray Wilson's personal favorite track on the album.
It succeeds because of its atmosphere. It leans into a heavy, dramatic, almost brooding rock mood.
Yeah, it really does.
And crucially, it was one of the few places where the arrangement actually evolved to accommodate the singer. The sources note the arrangement went through several changes as they had Wilson sing various melody lines, testing the limits and character of his voice.
Right. When you listen to it, the heavy, plodding guitar riff perfectly complements Wilson's darker, grunge-leaning baritone. It feels like a genuine integration. It feels heavy.
It does.
Then you have a track like Small Talk, which the sources point out is notable because the lyrics were written entirely by Wilson. It shows a brief flash of them, allowing him some creative real estate, letting him speak in his own voice.
But the true tragedy of the Calling All Stations studio sessions isn't what made it onto the album. It's what was deliberately left off.
Oh, the B-sides. The casualty list of this album is just infuriating when you read about it.
It really is.
There is a specific track called Anything Now. And according to the sources, during the sessions, Anything Now was considered one of the absolute strongest tracks they had recorded.
But it doesn't make the album.
Yeah.
And the justification for its exclusion is the most damning piece of evidence regarding the band's internal dysfunction.
It's crazy. Tony Banks claimed they left off this incredibly strong track because, and I quote, "we couldn't quite get Ray to sing it right."
Let's dissect the profound arrogance of that statement. You are a veteran songwriter. You have composed a piece of music you believe is brilliant.
Okay.
But your newly hired lead singer, a man with a completely different vocal range and stylistic background than your previous singer, is struggling to hit the phrasing or the notes exactly as you hear them in your head.
Right.
What is the role of a producer and a collaborator in that moment?
You change the key. You adapt the melody. You work with the vocalist to mold the song around their unique strengths so they can deliver a passionate performance.
Exactly. But Tony Banks was entirely inflexible. Instead of adapting the song to fit the singer they had just banked their entire future on, he simply threw the song in the vault, deciding it was better to discard a great piece of music than to compromise his original vision.
And it wasn't an isolated incident. The sources list an entire graveyard of B-sides from these sessions. Papa, he said, Banjo Man, Fret, 78, Sign Your Life Away, Run Out of Time, and an unreleased promo track called Nowhere Else to Turn.
So many tracks.
Yeah, and some of these ended up as B-sides on CD singles, completely hidden from the general public.
When a band has that volume of material relegated to B-sides, while the core album itself is struggling to find a cohesive identity, it indicates a catastrophic failure in the curation process.
For sure.
They were making the wrong choices about what represented this new version of Genesis.
And what does that mean for you, the listener, who goes to a record store in September 1997 and buys this CD? You put it in your stereo, and what do you hear?
A mess, honestly.
The sources describe it as a jarring mix. It is a patchwork quilt of incompatible ambitions. You have moments of complex progressive rock awkwardly bumping up against attempts at slick commercial pop, all filtered through the muddy, alternative vocal style of a guy they clearly didn't fully trust to drive the car.
It is an album suffering from a profound identity crisis. But despite the internal musical friction, and despite the compromises they made in the track list, the external corporate machine of Genesis was not about to scale back.
No way.
The marketing department, the management, the record labels, they were all still operating under the assumption that this was the biggest band in the world.
Which brings us back to the tarmac, the grand launch. Armed with a compromised album and a frontman they kept on a tight leash, Genesis steps out of the studio and throws absolutely everything they have into a massive, blindingly expensive global launch.
Right.
They have to convince a skeptical public that the magic hasn't disappeared.
The scale of this promotional push is almost comical in hindsight, given what we know about the album's actual quality. They split the launch into two massive events.
Okay, tell us about them.
On August 26, 1997, they hold the European launch. They commandeer the television tower in Berlin. They host a massive live press conference, broadcast an acoustic set, and partner with VH1 to ensure it saturates the European market.
A hostile takeover of the Berlin skyline.
Yeah.
Sure, that's high profile. But 2 days later, on August 28, they cross the Atlantic for the North American launch, and they decide the only venue grand enough to announce their return is the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
It's just wild.
They do a live interview and an acoustic performance that is beamed out as a nationwide radio special across the United States.
It is peak, unchecked 1990s hubris. You launch rockets from the Space Center, not an aging prog rock band trying to reinvent itself.
Right.
It is a desperate attempt to manufacture a sense of historical importance.
But the chart reality was brutal. They tried to launch this album into orbit, and in America, it practically exploded on the launch pad before it even cleared the tower.
It really did.
Let's look at the stark geographic divide in the numbers, because this is where the story splits into two completely different realities.
We have to analyze the United Kingdom first, their home turf. The album peaks at number 2 on the UK charts. On the surface, number 2 sounds like a success. But context is everything. This was the very first Genesis studio album not to hit number 1 in the UK since 1978. It broke a 2-decade winning streak.
And it failed to generate a massive hit. It was their first album not to produce a UK top 20 single since 1976. The lead single they pushed, a song called Combo, stalled out at number 29.
So in the UK, it is a definitive stumble and noticeable loss of altitude. but it still achieved gold certification, meaning it sold 100,000 copies.
Right.
It was respectable enough to avoid total embarrassment.
But then you look at the United States, and the U.S. market was a total unmitigated collapse.
Oh, completely.
The album peaked at number 54 on the Billboard 200. This was the first time a Genesis album missed the top 50 since 1973. That is pre-Phil Collins frontman era.
Wow.
And for the first time since 1976, they had absolutely zero charting singles in the U.S. The radio completely ignored them.
Yet, if you look back across the ocean to mainland Europe, the picture changes entirely again. It hit number 2 in Germany, number 2 in Norway, and number 2 on the overall European albums chart. It achieved gold status in France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and Switzerland.
This geographic split is fascinating. How does an album go gold in 6 European countries but can't even crack the top 50 in the United States?
It's strange, right?
Why did Europe embrace it or at least buy it out of loyalty while the American market violently rejected it?
It comes down to fundamentally different cultures of music consumption, specifically regarding legacy rock bands. Historically, European audiences have shown a much deeper, more ingrained loyalty to progressive rock.
Okay, that makes sense.
They view these bands almost like classical ensembles. They were more willing to follow an institution through personnel changes and stylistic experiments. They bought the album because it said Genesis on the cover.
And the U.S. market?
The U.S. market in late 1997 was absolutely ruthless and aggressively trend-driven. Think about the cultural landscape.
We're right, late 90s.
U.S. radio was dominated by the aggressive angst of nu metal. Bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit, the lingering depression of post-grunge, and the exploding sugar rush of teen pop like the Backstreet Boys and the Spice Girls.
Right. There was no middle ground.
Exactly. So here comes Genesis, a 1970s prog band known for 1980s pop, showing up with a new singer, trying to sound vaguely 90s alternative, but still using massive synth washes.
It's a mess.
American radio programmers didn't just dislike it, they literally didn't know what format to put it in. It was completely culturally orphaned in the U.S.
And that complete failure to launch in America wasn't just a byproduct of changing radio formats. It was heavily influenced by a music press that had been quietly sharpening its knives for over a decade, just waiting for the moment Genesis finally showed a weakness.
The critical reception of Calling All Stations is a bloodbath. It's honestly tough to read, even retrospectively.
Let's read some of the obituaries. Steve Knopper, writing for the Chicago Tribune, absolutely savaged the record.
Oh, yeah.
He called the album a formless blob of synth sounds, and he went straight for the new guy's throat, stating that Ray Wilson had no confidence or personality, let alone the vision to stave off his bandmates' meandering ideas.
That review attacks both the architecture and the tenant. It accuses Banks and Rutherford of meandering and Wilson of being too weak to stop them.
Right.
But the British press was somehow even meaner.
Oh, the NME was lethal. Tom Cox reviewed it for the NME and famously labeled the album tantamount to a service station Muzak rock opera.
Service station Muzak. We need to unpack why he used that specific phrasing.
Yeah, break that down.
Muzak is background noise. It is designed to be inoffensive, unchallenging, and easily ignored while you pump gas or ride an elevator.
Right.
By calling a Genesis album, a band known for complex time signatures and dramatic narratives, Muzak, Cox is saying the music has been completely stripped of its teeth. The rigid studio control, the digital radar system, the refusal to adapt to Wilson's voice. It resulted in an album that sounded expensive but entirely hollow. It was audio wallpaper.
That is devastating. Now, publications like Rolling Stone and AllMusic were slightly more measured, but no less dismissive of the final product.
True.
Both of them actually went out of their way to agree that Ray Wilson was a fitting vocal replacement for Collins, which is a nice compliment to him. They recognized he was trying, but they both thought the material he was handed was just incredibly weak.
Rolling Stone delivered a very specific insult. They called it a Mike and the Mechanics arch rock album.
Ouch.
They were slamming the fact that it lacked any cohesive Genesis style, implying it just sounded like Rutherford's side project dressed up in cheap, progressive rock clothing.
And time didn't heal these wounds. The sources note that even in 2014, Stevie Chicks, writing a retrospective for The Guardian, didn't even bother to analyze the record. He simply dismissed the entire album with one word: inexplicable.
When you read a wall of vitriol like that, you have to ask a broader, critical question. Were these journalists actually reviewing the sonic frequencies on the compact disc? Or were they reviewing the audacity of Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford trying to exist without Phil Collins?
That is exactly what I was wondering. Phil Collins was a ubiquitous cultural force. He was everywhere in the 80s and 90s.
Everywhere.
For the remaining two guys to stand up and say, We can do this without him. We are the true genius of the band. That invites a level of hostile scrutiny that almost no album could survive. I think the critics were absolutely punishing them for their hubris as much as for the formless synth sounds.
I agree completely. It was a targeted takedown of their ego. And the weight of that critical and commercial failure eventually forced the band members themselves to break their silence and admit defeat.
The retrospective regret is really heavy in these sources. In a 2019 interview, Tony Banks finally admitted he had deep regrets about the album.
Wow.
He said the album suffered from a uniformity that he regretted, which is a polite way of saying all the songs sounded the same because he refused to let them breathe. He admitted they included weak tracks and explicitly acknowledged that leaving off the two strongest B-sides was a critical mistake.
It takes over 20 years of distance for an artist of that stature to publicly admit they curated their own comeback album poorly.
It really does.
But Mike Rutherford's realization is perhaps even more poignant because it strikes at the core of their identity.
Yes, this part of the source material stopped me in my tracks. Rutherford noted that the mood for radio play had fundamentally changed, and because they couldn't fit into it, he realized that Genesis was becoming what he called a catalog act.
The catalog act, that is a highly sanitized boardroom industry term for a deeply painful artistic reality.
It is the ultimate bitter pill. Let's really think about what that means. You are Mike Rutherford. You have spent your entire adult life pushing boundaries, inventing new sounds, defining the culture of multiple decades.
Right.
And suddenly, you realize you have transitioned from being a current culture creator into a museum exhibit of your own past. The world no longer cares what you are going to invent tomorrow. They only want to know how accurately you can play the song you invented 20 years ago. The psychological shift from artist to archivist has to be devastating.
But, as any historian will tell you, museum exhibits still draw incredible crowds.
Sure.
And this is where the financial machinery of the band traps them. Despite the critical panning, despite the U.S. chart failure, they had achieved gold status across Europe. They had a financial and contractual obligation to take this new, critically maligned lineup on the road. The machine demanded a tour.
Which leads us to the final painful chapter, hitting the road and subsequently hitting a massive, immovable brick wall.
The Calling All Stations tour was an exercise in deeply contrasting realities. They booked a 47-date European tour running from January to May of 1998. They were playing large arenas, capitalizing on that lingering European loyalty. The core trio of Banks, Rutherford, and Wilson was joined by Nirzid Kyahu on drums and an Irish musician named Anthony Drennan on guitar and bass.
I have to throw in a quick detail from the sources here because the irony is just too perfect.
Oh, please do.
Genesis actually tried to hire Daryl Stormer, their old beloved touring guitarist, to join them for this run, but he couldn't do it because he was already booked working on a tour with Phil Collins.
It perfectly highlights how inextricably linked their careers still were, and how Collins was still inadvertently draining resources from the mothership.
It's hilarious.
Now, to make this European tour function musically, the band had to make some severe logistical accommodations for Ray Wilson. A majority of the older classic Genesis songs, the massive hits, had to be transposed into a lower key to accommodate his baritone vocal range.
And we really need to explain the physics of transposing a song for a live show because it is not just a minor technical tweak. It fundamentally alters the molecular structure of the music.
It completely changes it.
When Phil Collins is belting out a song like Invisible Touch or Turn It On, again at the very top of his vocal register, he is straining. There is a frantic, electric, desperate energy to it because he is pushing his physical limits. The tension of the high notes is literally part of the composition.
That is exactly right. The struggle creates the excitement.
So when you take that exact same song and you drop the key down a whole step or two so a grunge baritone can sing it comfortably, you strip out all the tension.
Yeah.
The song suddenly becomes heavier, thicker, maybe even a bit sluggish. You are effectively playing a cover version that saps the electric energy out of the nostalgia people paid $100 a ticket to feel.
And the band recognized this disconnect. To try and bridge the gap with the older fans, they featured an acoustic medley of their 1970s progressive material midway through the set. It was a nod to the purists.
Okay.
And if you are curious about what this actually sounded like, we do have an official record. Tracks from their show at the NEC Arena in Birmingham, specifically The Dividing Line and Not About Us, were eventually officially released in 2023 on a compilation called BDC Broadcasts.
So Europe, for the most part, shows up. They grind through 47 dates. But then we look at the United States. And this is where the wheels completely detach from the vehicle.
The management had originally booked a massive 27-date North American tour in large arenas, scheduled to kick off in November 1997.
But it gets canceled before it even starts. What? Abysmal, embarrassing ticket sales.
Wow.
They simply were not moving inventory. The American public looked at the Space Center launch and collectively shrugged. So the management panics and tries to save face. They spin it. They say, okay, the arenas are too big. We want a more intimate vibe for this new lineup.
Right, spin the narrative.
So they pivot and they book a revised 22-date tour in much smaller venues, theaters, large clubs, that sort of thing.
And
then that secondary tour was also canceled.
the crushing psychological blow of having to cancel a U.S. tour not once but twice cannot be overstated for a band of this stature.
It is genuinely stunning. Let's put this into a real-world perspective. Imagine you throw a massive, lavish party at a sprawling mansion. You send out thousands of expensive invitations.
Right.
And as the day approaches, you realize nobody RSVP'd. The silence is deafening. So deeply embarrassed, you scale it down. You send out new invites, moving the party to a small back room at the local pub, hoping your closest friends will at least show up out of pity. And people still refuse to come.
It is the ultimate ego death for a stadium rock band. You go from selling out multiple consecutive nights at Giant Stadium just a few years prior to being completely unable to fill a mid-sized theater.
It was the undeniable flashing red signal that the experiment had failed. The market had spoken, and it was brutal. Following the European dates, which ended with performances at the Rock am Ring and Rock im Park festivals in Germany, the band simply gave up.
They threw in the towel.
They disbanded. The entire Genesis machinery was quietly powered down. The name effectively lay dormant for nearly a decade until 2007.
And what happened in 2007?
They finally launched the Turn It On Again reunion tour, with Phil Collins firmly back behind the microphone.
The natural order was restored, physics was obeyed, the missing steel beam was put back into the skyscraper.
Exactly. The building stopped swaying. But looking back at this entire saga forces us to examine the legacy of the Calling All Stations era and what it actually means for you, the listener, when you think about your relationship with the art you love.
Let's briefly recap the staggering journey this band took. We started with the departure of a legend who felt the suffocating weight of playing a part.
Yep.
We watched two founders cling to control, undergoing a mechanical audition process, eventually hiring a grunge singer while passively rejecting another candidate via a Christmas card.
Which is still hilarious. We explored the deeply flawed studio dynamics, the rigid control of the radar system, the refusal to adapt to Wilson's voice, the corporate rejection of Chester Thompson, and the tragic burial of the best songs as B-sides.
We saw the geographic divide. European loyalty holding steady while the American market completely rejected their absurd Space Center launch.
Right.
We were at the critical bloodbath. And finally, a double tour cancellation that shattered the illusion and forced a legendary band into a 10-year hibernation.
It is a remarkable story of stubbornness, miscalculation, and ultimately the painful acceptance of reality. And it leaves me thinking deeply about Mike Rutherford's realization that they had become a catalog act.
That realization is exactly what I want to leave the listener with today. We spent a lot of time criticizing Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford for their rigid studio decisions, and we criticized the album for its lack of cohesion. But we also need to turn the mirror on ourselves as an audience.
How so? What do you mean?
When a legendary band fails to launch a new era, when they try to evolve, when they bring in new blood and experiment with a darker sound, is it truly just because the new music is objectively bad?
Interesting.
Or is it because we, the audience, selfishly refuse to let our heroes evolve past the exact version of them we fell in love with when we were teenagers? By refusing to buy tickets, by demanding they sound exactly like 1986, are we the ones who force legacy bands to become museum exhibits? Are we the wardens keeping them frozen in time?
Wow, are we the reason the building is never allowed to be remodeled? That is a profound question to leave on. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture, the hubris, and the heartbreak of Genesis in 1997. I highly encourage you to go find a copy of Calling All Stations, listen to it with all this new context ringing in your ears. See if you can hear the rigid control, the clash of grunge and prog, and the sound of a band desperately fighting against time. Until next time, keep diving deep.